Ladies and gentlemen, wars are not only fought on battlefields. They are fought in factories, supply chains, and commodities markets, often far from the headlines. While attention focuses on troop movements and diplomatic statements, a quieter crisis is unfolding beneath the surface. It is a crisis measured not in territory, but in materials. One of those materials is silver, and today it offers a powerful proof of how modern conflict is reshaping the global economy. This is the missile squeeze, not a slogan, but a signal that war is consuming resources faster than the world is prepared to replace them. Silver is not just a precious metal. It is a strategic material embedded in electronics, energy systems, medical devices, and advanced defense manufacturing. It is used in guidance systems, communications hardware, and high-reliability components where failure is not an option. When conflict intensifies, demand for such materials rises sharply and immediately. Unlike oil or food, silver shortages do not appear overnight on store shelves. They appear quietly, in delayed production, rising costs, and shrinking inventories. By the time markets react, the strain is already deep. Modern warfare has fundamentally changed in character, and with that change has come a dramatic shift in what war consumes. In earlier eras, conflict was measured primarily in manpower, ammunition, and territory. Today, it is measured just as much in materials, components, and industrial capacity. Advanced military systems rely on precision electronics, secure communications, sensors, and guidance technologies, all of which depend on a steady flow of strategic materials. Silver has emerged as one of the most telling examples of this transformation. Unlike conventional raw materials, silver plays a critical role in high-performance applications where reliability and conductivity are essential. It is embedded deep inside modern defense systems, not as a visible component, but as a functional necessity. As conflicts become more technologically driven and more prolonged, the demand for these systems rises continuously rather than in short bursts. This creates a sustained draw on materials that were once assumed to be plentiful or easily replaceable. What makes this shift especially significant is that modern wars do not pause civilian demand. Electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, medical technology, and advanced manufacturing all rely on the same material base. When war-driven demand accelerates, it does not replace civilian consumption, it competes with it. The result is not a single shortage, but a tightening across multiple sectors at the same time. This convergence places extraordinary pressure on supply chains that were never designed to support both sustained military use and global industrial growth simultaneously. The intensity of modern warfare also amplifies the speed at which materials are consumed. High-tech systems require constant maintenance, replacement, and upgrading. Components are not simply stockpiled and forgotten. They are cycled rapidly as technology evolves and operational demands increase. Each cycle pulls more material from the global supply pool, reducing available inventories and increasing vulnerability to disruption. This reality exposes a critical miscalculation in how war has been planned and financed. Military preparedness has often focused on weapon systems and budgets, while underestimating the material foundations that make those systems possible. When conflicts stretch over months and years, the strain on strategic resources becomes unavoidable. Silver's rising importance illustrates that modern warfare is not only a test of military strength, but a test of industrial endurance, supply chain resilience, and long-term economic capacity. In this context, war is no longer confined to battlefields or defense ministries. It reaches into mines, refineries, factories, and global trade routes, transforming strategic materials into silent indicators of how deeply conflict reshapes the modern world. Silver's role in the global system has undergone a quiet but profound transformation. Once treated primarily as an industrial input or investment metal, it has increasingly become a strategic asset whose availability carries political, economic, and security implications. This shift is not driven by speculation or market fashion, but by structural changes in how modern economies and defense systems function. Silver's unique physical properties, exceptional conductivity, reliability, and resistance to failure, make it indispensable in high-performance environments where substitutes are limited or impractical. As technology has advanced, silver has been embedded deeper into critical systems rather than used superficially. It is no longer a material that can be easily swapped out without redesigning entire platforms. Defense electronics, secure communications, advanced sensors, and energy infrastructure depend on silver at a foundational level. When access to such a material becomes uncertain, the issue is not cost alone, but continuity. Strategic assets are defined not just by scarcity, but by irreplaceability, and silver increasingly fits that definition. This reclassification of silver alters how governments and industries must think about supply. Traditional commodity logic assumes that higher prices will attract new production and restore balance. Strategic assets do not respond so quickly. Mining expansion takes years, refining capacity is concentrated, and environmental and regulatory constraints limit rapid scaling. In the meantime, demand from both military and civilian sectors continues to rise, driven by electrification, digitization, and ongoing geopolitical tension. The strategic nature of silver also changes its role in international relations. Control over processing, refining, and distribution becomes a source of leverage. Countries that dominate. These stages gain influence not only over markets but over the operational capacity of others. Decisions that appear technical, export rules, licensing requirements, or stockpiling policies, carry strategic weight when they affect access to critical materials. As silver moves from commodity to strategic asset, it exposes the limitations of policies that treat material security as a secondary concern. Economic growth, technological leadership, and national security increasingly depend on the same inputs. In such an environment, silver is no longer just a metal traded on exchanges. It is a barometer of resilience, signaling how prepared economies are to sustain both innovation and security under pressure. The growing strain on silver supplies illustrates how war-driven demand collides directly with civilian industry in ways that are often underestimated. Military consumption does not exist in isolation. It draws from the same global pool of materials that supports modern economies. When conflicts intensify and persist, the materials required for defense systems are diverted at scale, placing immediate pressure on industries that rely on uninterrupted access to those same inputs. This competition is structural, not temporary, and it reshapes priorities across entire supply chains. Civilian industries dependent on silver are among the most strategically important for long-term economic growth. Renewable energy infrastructure, electric vehicles, medical technologies, and advanced electronics all require silver for performance and reliability. These sectors are not optional or discretionary. They are central to energy transitions, healthcare systems, and technological competitiveness. When military demand expands rapidly, it does not pause these industries. It forces them to compete for availability, often at higher cost and with reduced certainty. This collision creates difficult trade-offs. Governments must balance immediate security needs with long-term economic objectives, while manufacturers face rising input costs and delayed production timelines. Projects planned around stable material access become vulnerable to disruption, and innovation pipelines slow as firms reassess feasibility and risk. Smaller producers are particularly exposed, lacking the financial flexibility or supplier leverage to absorb prolonged shortages. The effects ripple outward through labor markets and investment decisions. Uncertainty discourages capital deployment in sectors already facing tight margins and regulatory complexity. As costs rise, consumers ultimately bear the burden through higher prices or reduced availability of technologies essential to modern life. What begins as a material allocation issue gradually becomes an economic and social challenge. This dynamic also underscores a broader shift in how conflict impacts global systems. Modern wars no longer affect only defense budgets and diplomatic relations, they reshape industrial priorities and economic trajectories. When strategic materials are pulled toward military use, civilian progress does not stop. It slows, fragments, and becomes more uneven. The collision between military demand and civilian industry reveals how deeply intertwined security and economic resilience have become in an era defined by technology, prolonged conflict, and constrained resources. The inability of supply chains to scale at the speed of conflict reveals a fundamental mismatch between modern demand shocks and industrial reality. When war escalates, demand for strategic materials rises sharply and immediately, driven by sustained operational requirements rather than short-term stockpiling. Supply, however, responds on a completely different timeline. Mining projects require years of exploration, financing, permitting, and construction before any material reaches the market. Refining capacity is even more constrained, often concentrated in a limited number of facilities that cannot be expanded quickly, without significant capital and regulatory approval. This time lag creates structural strain. Even when prices rise and signals are clear, the physical system cannot respond fast enough to restore balance. Existing inventories are drawn down first, creating the illusion of stability. But once those buffers thin, disruptions surface rapidly. Manufacturers encounter delays, procurement becomes uncertain, and long-term contracts are renegotiated under pressure. The system is not failing because of mismanagement, but because it was never designed to absorb prolonged high-intensity demand from conflict alongside steady civilian consumption. Geography compounds the problem. Silver mining and refining are unevenly distributed, exposing supply chains to geopolitical risk, logistical bottlenecks, and regulatory divergence. Environmental standards, labor availability, and infrastructure constraints further limit how quickly output can increase. Recycling offers some relief, but it cannot fully offset primary supply shortages at scale, particularly when demand growth is simultaneous across multiple sectors. As a result, scarcity becomes persistent rather than episodic. Volatility replaces predictability, complicating planning for both governments and firms. Capital investment becomes more cautious. Innovation timelines stretch, and substitution efforts face technical and performance limitations. The inability to scale supply at the pace of conflict transforms material access into a strategic vulnerability, where timing matters as much as quantity. In such conditions, even well-capitalized industries find themselves constrained not by ambition or demand, but by the slow, rigid mechanics of extraction and processing in a world where conflict accelerates faster than industry can adapt. When shortages of strategic materials begin to surface, their effects extend far beyond defense planning and industrial logistics, quickly evolving into economic and political risks. Silver. Scarcity illustrates how tightly interconnected modern systems have become. What starts as pressure within a specific supply chain soon influences prices, investment behavior, and policy decisions. Rising costs for critical inputs translate into higher production expenses, which filter through industries and ultimately affect consumers. Inflationary pressure is not driven only by energy or labor, but increasingly by materials that underpin advanced technology. These economic stresses create political consequences. Governments are forced to respond to rising prices, slowing industrial output, and public concern over economic stability. Policy debates intensify as leaders face competing priorities, sustaining defense readiness, protecting domestic industries, and maintaining affordability for households. Strategic material shortages complicate these decisions because they cannot be resolved quickly through fiscal measures alone. Monetary tools are limited when the constraint is physical supply rather than demand. Industrial competitiveness also becomes a political issue. Countries that secure access to strategic materials gain advantages in manufacturing, innovation, and export capacity. those that cannot face declining market share and weakened bargaining power in global trade. This imbalance fuels geopolitical tension, as material access becomes a factor in diplomatic relationships and alliance structures. Trade policy, once focused primarily on tariffs and market access, increasingly centers on resource security and supply chain control. Public perception adds another layer of complexity. When shortages disrupt clean energy projects, technology rollout, or manufacturing employment, confidence in long-term policy goals erodes. Energy transitions slow, industrial strategies face skepticism, and political opposition gains momentum. Strategic material constraints thus influence not only economic outcomes, but public trust and political stability. Over time, these pressures reshape policy priorities. Governments begin to reassess assumptions about globalization, resilience, and strategic autonomy. Silver shortages demonstrate that material security is inseparable from economic management and political credibility. In a world where strategic resources underpin both prosperity and security, managing their availability becomes a defining challenge of governance, with consequences that reach far beyond any single industry or conflict. The pressure on global silver supplies signals a broader transformation in how security must be understood and planned. Traditional approaches to national security emphasized military capability, diplomatic alliances, and financial strength as largely separate domains. That separation is no longer sustainable. Strategic materials now sit at the intersection of all three, shaping the ability of states to defend themselves, grow economically, and maintain political stability. Silver's role in this equation illustrates how material resilience has become a core component of modern security planning. In this emerging landscape, preparedness is no longer measured solely by weapons systems or defense budgets, but by the robustness of supply chains that support them. Access to critical materials determines whether advanced technologies can be produced, maintained, and scaled over time. When that access is uncertain, strategic planning becomes reactive rather than proactive. Governments are forced to respond to shortages instead of shaping outcomes, reducing their ability to manage long-term risk. This shift demands a reassessment of policy frameworks that treated resource availability as a market issue rather than a strategic concern. Market mechanisms alone cannot ensure resilience when supply is constrained by geography, regulation, or geopolitical tension. Strategic planning must therefore incorporate material security alongside energy, food, and infrastructure resilience. This includes diversification of supply, investment in domestic and allied capacity, and greater emphasis on recycling and efficiency without sacrificing performance. The implications extend beyond defense ministries into economic and industrial policy. Decisions about energy transitions, technology investment, and manufacturing strategy are inseparable from material availability. When these policies are misaligned, ambition outpaces capability, creating gaps that undermine credibility and effectiveness. Coordinated planning becomes essential, linking security objectives with industrial development and long-term economic sustainability. Silver's current strain offers a preview of future challenges facing other strategic materials. It demonstrates that security in the modern era is systemic rather than sector-specific. Nations that recognize this integration early will be better positioned to adapt, while those that cling to outdated distinctions between economic and national security risk repeated disruption. In an interconnected world defined by prolonged conflict and technological dependence, strategic foresight increasingly begins with control over the materials that make modern systems possible. The story of silver is not about metal, it is about limits. It is about what happens when the demands of war collide with the realities of production. The missile squeeze is proof that conflict now reaches deep into the foundations of the global economy. The question facing policymakers is not whether this pressure exists. The question is whether the world chooses to prepare for it, adapt to it, and manage it, or continue to be surprised by it. Because in the modern era, the true cost of war is not only measured in weapons fired, but in resources consumed. and silver is telling us that the bill is coming due. Thank you.